When we picture ancient Greece, we imagine gleaming marble temples, brilliant philosophers debating in the agora, and the birthplace of democracy itself. But beneath this polished veneer lay a social structure so rigid and hierarchical that it would make your skin crawl. Today, we're diving deep into the controversial social hierarchies that defined Greek civilization, revealing truths that historians have often avoided discussing. If you're fascinated by the darker corners of history, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which ancient civilization you, like me, to explore next. The ancient Greeks didn't just have different attitudes about relationships and intimacy. They constructed an entire social pyramid based on power and dominance that determined everything from your legal rights to your political influence, and even your status as a member of society. This wasn't some abstract philosophical concept gathering dust in academic texts. This hierarchy shaped real laws, affected real lives, and created systems of exploitation that operated for centuries. At the foundation of this system was a simple but devastating principle. Your position in intimate or social encounters often translated into your position in society. The person who held dominance held power politically, legally, and economically. The person who was in a subordinate position faced social exclusion, legal vulnerability, and a lack of power. This created a culture where dominance was seen as the ultimate expression of citizenship and masculine authority. But here's where it becomes truly unsettling. This hierarchy didn't only affect adults making their own choices. It systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of society, creating institutional frameworks that would be immediately recognized today as deeply exploitative. Children, women, slaves, and foreigners often existed solely to serve the desires of adult male citizens, with elaborate cultural justifications that normalized inequality. Let us start with a practice that reveals just how embedded this system had become. The so-called educational relationships between adult men and adolescent boys. This wasn't hidden behavior that society condemned or even tolerated reluctantly. It was the cornerstone of elite education, celebrated in poetry, depicted in artwork, and protected by specific laws that regulated, rather than prohibited, such arrangements. The system operated with methodical precision. Adult men in their 30s would pursue relationships with boys beginning around age 12, following established social protocols that families not only accepted but actively encouraged. Parents viewed these arrangements as pathways to social advancement for their sons, often overlooking the problematic aspects in favor of political and educational opportunities. The older partner, known as the erased, would court his chosen boy through gifts, public demonstrations of affection, and social displays designed to advertise the relationship to the community. These were not secret affairs conducted in shame. They were public courtships that enhanced both parties' social standing. With the man gaining prestige for securing a young partner, and the boy gaining access to influential networks. The truly concerning aspect was the calculated nature of the age restrictions. Boys became available for these relationships at the onset of puberty, and were expected to transition out when they developed adult masculine features, typically around 18 to 20 years old. This timing wasn't about protecting young people from inappropriate relationships. It was about maintaining the power dynamic that made these arrangements socially acceptable. Once a boy developed the physical markers of manhood, continuing the relationship would threaten the fundamental hierarchy that made Greek society function. An adult male citizen could not be seen as subordinate to another man without risking his political rights, legal standing, and social respect. The system required a constant supply of young partners who could be managed without threatening the adult's authority. The educational justification added layers of psychological manipulation that made resistance nearly impossible. These relationships were presented as mentorships, where experienced men taught young boys about politics, philosophy, rhetoric, and social graces. But the personal component was considered essential to the learning process, creating emotional bonds that supposedly enhanced intellectual and character development. Spartan military culture took these practices to even more extreme levels through their legendary training system. Boys, as young as 7, were removed from their families and placed into institutional settings, where older warriors became their mentors and trainers, sometimes forming close personal bonds. The practice was so deeply embedded in military culture that refusing participation could end a boy's career before it began. The selection process was methodical and often harsh, with older warriors choosing favorites based on physical ability and family connections. Boys who weren't selected faced social exclusion and limited career prospects, while those who were chosen entered relationships they had little power to refuse, with men who controlled every aspect of their daily lives. The training combined physical hardship with emotional manipulation, deliberately keeping boys underfed, inadequately clothed, and subjected to harsh discipline. In this vulnerable state, they depended entirely on their older partners for protection, food, and support, creating conditions for potential psychological control. But these practices targeting young males were just one component of a broader system that reduced women to property and dependence through equally systematic methods. Marriage in ancient Greece bore little resemblance to modern concepts of partnership or mutual consent. It was often a business transaction where fathers arranged marriages for their daughters, typically in exchange for dowries. The age gaps in these marriages were significant. Men typically married in their 30s after establishing their careers and financial stability, while girls could be married as early as 12 or 13 years old. These were not partnerships between equals, but arrangements where adult men gained legal authority over much younger spouses. The wedding nights in these marriages often involved what modern law would consider highly problematic conduct. But Greek culture celebrated these encounters as the legitimate consummation of proper marriages. The girls had no voice in these arrangements, no legal recourse if they were treated poorly, and no escape from relationships they never chose to enter. Greek law codified women's inferior status with great precision. Married women couldn't own property, conduct business, make legal decisions, or even leave their homes without their husband's permission. They existed under masculine authority, with little institutional protection if that authority was abused. The isolation imposed on women reached levels that would be considered imprisonment by modern standards. Respectable women were confined to their homes, forbidden from participating in public life, attending entertainment, or engaging in social activities that included men. Their entire world shrank to domestic duties and child rearing, with few opportunities for personal fulfillment or intellectual development. Even within these restrictive marriages, women faced additional humiliations. Husbands routinely maintained relationships with male lovers, female servants, and professional companions, and these were not hidden or considered shameful. They were expected aspects of masculine behavior that wives were required to accept. The sexual double standard was absolute. A wife's infidelity was punishable by severe penalties, including exile from the community. A husband's extramarital affairs were considered normal male behavior that demonstrated his social status. Women who objected to their husband's affairs were viewed as unreasonable or disruptive to social stability. Religious institutions added another dimension to women. Experiences through practices that commodified their bodies under divine sanction. The temple of Aphrodite in Corinth, for example, maintained a large number of so-called sacred companions. Women who had been dedicated to temple service by their families as religious offerings to the goddess. These women were not volunteers pursuing spiritual callings or making personal choices about their lives. They were offerings to economic and religious systems that generated significant income from their services. The religious framework provided moral justification for what amounted to institutional exploitation, making resistance not just difficult, but blasphemous. Families dedicated daughters to temple service, knowing the realities. But the religious context made these decisions appear virtuous rather than exploitative. Poor families saw temple dedication as their daughter's only option for survival, while wealthy families used it to discharge religious obligations. The scale of these operations was significant, with archaeological evidence revealing living quarters for hundreds of women, elaborate bathing facilities, and administrative buildings for managing what were, in effect, sexual businesses under the guise of religious practice. These temples generated enormous revenue, but the women themselves saw none of these profits. Another aspect of Greek culture was the use of magical practices designed to influence the feelings and actions of others. Ancient Greeks practiced love magic with the same casual acceptance they showed for any other form of commerce, sometimes viewing supernatural influence as a legitimate way to pursue relationships. These were not harmless romantic gestures, but calculated efforts to influence specific individuals through supernatural means. With elaborate rituals involving incantations and amulets, archaeological discoveries have uncovered thousands of cursed tablets containing requests directed at named individuals. These were not abstract wishes for love or affection, but detailed instructions to supernatural forces. The language used in these magical texts reflected a mindset that viewed relationships as something to be won, rather than mutual partnerships. Professional practitioners offered specialized services for different types of magical influence, with some focusing on attracting reluctant partners, while others specialized in breaking up existing relationships. Some spells were even designed to make individuals more receptive to advances. The effectiveness of these practices mattered less than their widespread social acceptance, which reflected broader attitudes about entitlement and autonomy. If women could be compelled through physical force, economic pressure, or social manipulation, magical influence seemed equally legitimate to practitioners, who saw little distinction between different methods of obtaining compliance. Even more concerning were references to inappropriate practices involving animals that appeared throughout Greek literature and historical accounts, while often attributed to other cultures in official histories. The frequency of references and mythological themes indicates these behaviors were known concepts in Greek society. The mythological framework provided cultural justification for acts that crossed boundaries. Through stories of gods transforming into animals to pursue mortals, these were not cautionary tales warning against inappropriate behavior, but celebrated myths performed in theaters and depicted in artwork, creating precedents that normalized certain acts. Medical and philosophical writings discussed these practices with clinical detachment, often debating whether such acts violated natural law or represented alternative expressions of human behavior. The limited concept of consent that existed for free citizens completely disappeared when dealing with slaves and foreign populations. These groups existed entirely outside legal protection, available for any form of exploitation their owners desired without restriction or consequence. Greek households routinely maintained slaves specifically purchased for domestic and personal purposes, with children born from these arrangements becoming property that continued the cycle of exploitation into subsequent generations. The legal framework supporting this system was comprehensive and ruthless, denying slaves any right to refuse demands or seek protection from abuse. The scale becomes clear when examining household inventories from wealthy families, which listed hundreds of slaves categorized by their intended purposes, including explicit personal functions. These were official documents filed for tax and insurance purposes, as the system operated openly under complete legal and social acceptance. As we examine the full scope of these practices, a disturbing pattern emerges that reveals the true nature of Greek civilization. Every aspect of their social culture operated through the fundamental principle that might makes right. Whether targeting children, women, slaves, or even animals, the philosophical justifications they created reveal the true genius of systematic oppression. By reframing exploitation as education, sexual servitude as religion, and magical coercion as romance, they transformed harmful practices into cultural virtues that victims couldn't resist because society celebrated them as beneficial. This wasn't a civilization struggling with moral questions about dignity and autonomy. This was a society that had definitively answered those questions by deciding that powerful individuals had rights over everyone else. The democracy that gave political voice to male citizens operated alongside systems designed to silence everyone else through social subjugation. The legacy of these practices echoes through history in ways most people never recognize. With philosophical frameworks that justified Greek exploitation influencing Roman law, Christian theology, and Western legal traditions. The same basic arguments used to defend these practices appear in modified forms throughout subsequent civilizations. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how sophisticated societies can normalize harmful behaviors through cultural conditioning and institutional support. The ancient Greeks weren't primitive people acting on base instincts. They were educated, philosophical individuals who created systematic justifications for practices they knew caused immense suffering. Perhaps most disturbing of all, they succeeded in presenting their civilization as the birthplace of reason, democracy, and human dignity. For thousands of years, scholars have studied Greek philosophy while ignoring Greek social realities, preserving inspiring myths while burying uncomfortable truths. The marble statues and democratic ideals survived in our cultural memory. The next time you encounter ancient Greece portrayed as a golden age of human achievement, remember the children forced into relationships with adult mentors, the women treated as property, the slaves who existed solely for their owner's benefit, and the magical practices designed to override consent. Behind every gleaming marble column stood a system built on exploitation, so comprehensive it makes many modern injustices appear limited by comparison. That's the real legacy of ancient Greek civilization, that traditional history classes have conveniently chosen to forget for centuries.